The room went completely silent the moment he walked in. Not the polite kind of silence you get when someone taps a fork against a champagne glass. I mean the kind where 200 people inhale at the same moment and forget to breathe out. Where conversation dies mid-sentence. Where even the string quartet in the corner stopped playing. Not because anyone signaled them to, but because the energy in that ballroom changed so suddenly that everyone felt it, including the musicians. My father was standing 6 feet away from me when it happened. And for the first time in my 32 years on this earth, I watched him look at me like he didn't know who I was. I'd been waiting for that moment longer than I could explain to anyone. Not because I wanted to humiliate him. That was never it. I just wanted him to see me, really see me. The way the rest of the world had finally started to. The way I'd been trying to show him since I was 17 years old, and told him I wanted to become a surgeon. He laughed then. Not a cruel laugh. Almost worse. The dismissive kind, like I'd said something mildly amusing and he was already moving on to something more interesting. Surgery, he said, and set down his coffee mug. You? 2 letters. 1 syllable. The entire trajectory of my self-worth at 17, dented in under a second. I grew up in a small town in central Ohio called Millbrook. If you blink driving through it, you miss the gas station, the diner, the one traffic light that nobody respects, and most of the ambition of every kid who ever grew up there. My parents had lived there their whole lives. My father, Gene, worked 31 years at a manufacturing plant outside of town before it closed down. My mother, Deborah, ran a daycare out of our house until her knees gave out. They were good people, hardworking people, but their vision of a good life had edges to it. Edges that didn't extend much past the county line. My older brother, Kevin, had gotten married right out of high school to a girl from our church, bought a house 2 streets over from our parents, and was coaching youth football by the time he was 23. My parents thought that was the right way to do things. Stable. Rooted. Present. I loved Kevin. Still do. But I was never Kevin. I was the one who checked out medical textbooks from the library at age 12. Who spent summer afternoons watching surgery live streams on YouTube, when the other kids in the neighborhood were at the community pool. Who had, by sophomore year of high school, who's already decided I was going to Johns Hopkins if it killed me. My father didn't take any of that seriously. He wasn't mean about it exactly. He just had this way of steering conversations, gently, consistently, back toward what he considered realistic. Maybe nursing, he said once, when I'd mentioned medical school costs. You'd still be helping people, and you wouldn't be in debt until you're 50. Another time, Kevin's brother-in-law makes great money in HVAC. 2-year program, and he owns his own truck now. He wasn't trying to crush me. I have to believe that. He was trying to protect me from what he saw as a long fall off a high ledge I had no business climbing. But it felt like he was pulling the ladder out from under me before I'd even taken the first step. The hardest part wasn't the practical skepticism. It was the comparison. My cousin Amber, my Aunt Patty's daughter, was 3 years older than me, and from the time I was 14, she became the measuring stick my family used for everything. Amber was pretty in an effortless, small-town kind of way. She'd stayed local, gotten an associate's degree in business, and married a guy named Todd, who owned 2 car washes and drove a pickup truck with a custom wrap on it. By the time I was a senior in high school, Amber and Todd had a baby, a farmhouse they were renovating, and a life that photographed beautifully for Facebook. My father adored Todd. They went fishing together. They talked about fantasy football. At every family gathering, Todd's name came up like a hymn. Todd had the sense to start building something real early. My father said to me once, maybe 6 months before I left for college. We were sitting at the kitchen table. I'd just gotten my early acceptance letter from Ohio State. Not Hopkins, but a real pre-med program, a genuine first step, and I was trying to share it with him. He hadn't said congratulations. He'd nodded, and then somehow the conversation had turned to Todd's second car wash location, opening up in Dayton. I folded the letter and put it back in my pocket. I didn't cry. I'd taught myself not to by then. College was the first time I understood what it felt like to be in a room full of people who took me seriously. I don't mean that in a dramatic way. I just mean, my professors looked at me when I talked. My study group argued with me, really argued, about mechanisms of disease and treatment options, and the ethics of clinical trials, and they argued like my opinion mattered enough to push back on. That had never happened to me before. At home, I was Jean and Deborah's daughter, who was going through a phase. I called home every Sunday. My mother always asked about my classes, my friends, whether I was eating enough. My father usually got on for a few minutes, asked if I needed money, and then handed the phone back. I was not the topic of conversation at family gatherings. That was fine. I had work to do. 4 years of pre-med, a gap year doing clinical volunteering in Pittsburgh, then medical school at Case Western. I barely slept for 4 years. I ate a lot of peanut butter crackers at midnight and studied pharmacology flashcards on the bus. I matched into a general surgery residency at University of Chicago Medicine, which is, and I do not say this to brag, but because the context matters, one of the most competitive surgical residency programs in the country. I did not tell my father where I matched until after I'd already signed the paperwork. When I told him, he said, "Chicago. That's expensive to live in." I said, "I know." He said, "Well, good luck with it." I hung up, stood in my apartment kitchen for a while, and then made myself dinner. Residency is a particular kind of suffering that nobody fully prepares you for. 80-hour weeks, sometimes more. You run on coffee and adrenaline and the desperate need to not be the one who makes the mistake that costs someone their life. I lost count of the nights I drove home from the hospital at 3 in the morning, still in scrubs, so tired that the streetlights blurred. I cried in supply closets twice. Once after losing a patient I'd been fighting for 3 weeks. Once just because I couldn't remember the last time I'd sat outside. I called home less during residency, not because I didn't want to, because there was nothing to say that would translate. My mother tried. She'd listen and make sympathetic noises and tell me she was proud of me. My father would occasionally get on the line and say something like, "You sleeping enough?" Which I think was his way of trying. But during my 3rd year of residency, something happened that I haven't fully stopped thinking about since. I came home for Thanksgiving. Kevin and his wife were there, Amber and Todd with their 2 kids, my Aunt Patty and Uncle Ron. The table was crowded and loud, and it smelled like my childhood in a way that made me feel both warm and slightly claustrophobic. At some point during dinner, Todd mentioned that he was opening a 3rd car wash location, this time in Columbus. My father lit up. They spent 20 minutes talking about commercial real estate and small business loans, and I watched my father lean across the table, engaged and animated in a way he never was when I talked about my work. I sat across the table and cut my turkey into small pieces, and tried to participate in a different conversation with my mother and Aunt Patty. Then my cousin Amber said, "So how's the doctor thing going?" The way she said doctor thing, just the particular casualness of someone who genuinely doesn't register it as a serious category, made something in my chest go tight. "It's going," I said. "You ever gonna have time to, date?" she asked. "You must never be home." My father made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. "She's very committed to her career," he said. The way he said career, with the faintest pause before and after it, like he was handling a word that didn't fully belong to him. I looked at him across the table. He looked back at me and picked up his fork. That was it. That was the whole moment. But I thought about it for months. I finished residency. I did a fellowship in minimally invasive and robotic surgery at Northwestern. I published 3 papers during fellowship, one of which got cited in a New England Journal of Medicine commentary. I got hired as an attending surgeon at Rush University Medical Center in Chicago, and 18 months later I was named director of the minimally invasive surgery program. None of this happened quickly. None of it happened easily. There are whole years of my life that were essentially just work and sleep, and the occasional Sunday morning, where I let myself walk to the coffee shop on the corner and read something that wasn't a medical journal. I didn't get the relationship my father wanted for me. The house, the husband, the photographable life. I dated a few people, none of whom lasted past the 18-month mark, usually because surgery schedules and surgical careers are genuinely hard to build a life around if the other person isn't on board with what that means. I made peace with that, mostly. There are nights when I don't, but mostly. What I didn't make peace with, and I know this is the part I'm supposed to say I eventually outgrew, and maybe I did outgrow needing it to be different, but that's not the same as not feeling it, was my father's opinion of what I'd done with my life. He never said he was proud of me. Not once. Not after I finished medical school. Not after I matched at Chicago. Not after my first paper was published, which my mother had printed out and laminated and put on the refrigerator. Bless her heart, even though she didn't understand half of what it said. He wasn't hostile. He'd given up the skeptical commentary by the time I was in fellowship. Maybe because it had started to seem undeniable that I was actually doing this. Or maybe because he'd just run out of gentle redirections. But absence isn't the same as warmth. The last time I'd been home before my brother's wedding was Christmas, 2 years prior. My father and I had sat in the living room, watching a bowl game and talking, politely, about nothing in particular. When I left, he hugged me and said, "Drive safe." And I drove the 4 hours back to Chicago with the radio on and thought, that's probably as good as it gets. I had made my peace with that, or so I thought. Kevin's wedding was in April. He was marrying a woman named Blythe. They'd been together for 4 years, and she was warm and funny and loved Kevin in a way that was completely obvious to everyone in a room. The wedding was at a vineyard about 40 minutes outside of Columbus. Elegant but not stiff, which was very Blythe. 2 weeks before the wedding, I got a text from my father. I was standing in a hospital corridor when my phone buzzed. I glanced at it between patients. It was long, longer than my father usually texted, and I stepped into an empty consult room to read it. "Ellie, I just want to say before the wedding that I think it would be nice if you kept things low-key. This is Kevin's day and Blythe's day. I know you've done well and that's great, but I don't think we need to make it a whole thing about your accomplishments. Amber's husband Todd is going to be a groomsman and his family will be there, and I don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable. Just wanted to mention it. I read it twice. Then I put my phone in my coat pocket and walked back into the hallway and went to see my next patient. I didn't respond for 2 days, not because I was being dramatic about it. I genuinely needed 2 days to figure out what was happening inside me when I read those words. I don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable. What he was actually saying, and we both knew it, was, don't let your success make Todd look small. Don't be more than what this family has room for. Don't take up too much space. I texted back, I'll be there for Kevin. That's all that matters. I drove to Columbus the Thursday before the wedding. My mother hugged me for a long time at the door and said I looked tired and also wonderful, which felt like the most accurate thing anyone had said about me in a while. That night I sat in my childhood bedroom, twin bed with the same quilt, same wasser stain on the ceiling I used to stare at doing homework. And I thought about my father's text. And I thought about all the years of conversations, shaped around making sure I didn't take up too much space. And I thought about the fact that I had spent 15 years becoming one of the foremost minimally invasive surgeons in the Midwest. And my father had texted me 2 weeks before my brother's wedding to remind me to stay small. And I thought, I'm going to wear my white coat. Not literally. But, I mean, the wedding was a vineyard wedding, not a formal event. But I had been invited, the week prior, to attend a dinner on Friday evening for a mentorship program I joined years ago. A program that connected young women in medicine with established practitioners, specifically focused on surgical fields which have historically and embarrassingly low numbers of women in leadership positions. The dinner happened to be in Columbus, and several of the attendees, women I'd worked with, been mentored by, whose careers had intersected with mine in various ways over 15 years, happened to know Kevin's fiancée Blythe through a medical school alumni network I hadn't been aware of. When Blythe found this out, 3 weeks before the wedding, she called me. Ellie, she said, would you be okay if I invited some of your colleagues to the reception? I reached out to a few of them through the alumni group. I think it would be really meaningful to have people there who know your work. Kevin talks about you all the time, and I want your people to be there too. I didn't understand the full weight of what she was offering. I just said, of course, that's really thoughtful. I didn't think to tell my father. The ceremony was beautiful, Kevin cried, which I was grateful for because it meant everyone was looking at him and not at me while I pulled myself together in the third row. Blythe was stunning. The vineyard was in its early spring bloom, soft and pale green and golden in the afternoon light. At the reception, I found my seat, hugged my relatives, said hello to Todd and Amber, was gracious and present and exactly what my father's text had asked me to be. Then, about 40 minutes into the cocktail hour, the event coordinator came to find me. Dr. Calloway? She said. She had the guest list, she knew my name. There are some guests arriving now who asked me to let you know they were here. I followed her toward the main entrance of the reception hall, and that's when I saw them. 14 women, some in formal wear, a few in professional attire, all of them women I had crossed paths with over 15 years of surgical medicine. My fellowship director from Northwestern, Dr. Vasquez Kim, who had first told me I had the hands and the instincts for robotic surgery, Dr. Nkem Dirim, who'd published alongside me, and whose friendship I counted as one of the genuine privileges of my career. Residents I'd mentored who had now finished their own training, women who had built their own programs, their own reputations, their own bodies of work in operating rooms across the Midwest and the East Coast, and at the front of the group, because of course she would be the one to orchestrate it, was Dr. Patricia Heshu, who had been my first surgical mentor, who had seen something in a terrified third-year medical student rotating through her service, and said quietly and without fanfare, "You belong here." She was 71 years old and had received the American College of Surgeons Distinguished Service Award the previous fall. She walked up to me and put both her hands on my face, the way she always did, like I was still 23 years old. "We couldn't miss it," she said. I couldn't speak for a moment. They had driven from Columbus, from Cleveland, from Cincinnati. 2 of them had flown in from Boston, not because Blythe had pressured them. I know Blythe, she would never. But because they had wanted to. We walked into the reception together. I wasn't thinking about my father's text. I wasn't thinking about anything except how full the room felt, how the light was catching the vineyard through the tall windows, how Kevin was across the room with his arm around Blythe, and he saw me and grinned and waved. Then Dr. Shu said something to the room. I don't know exactly how she arranged it with the DJ or the coordinator. I suspect Blythe had more to do with this than she ever let on. But the music went low and Dr. Heshu stepped forward, and she said, in a voice that carried, "Before the evening goes any further, I want to take 2 minutes to recognize someone in this room. Some of you know her as Kevin's sister. Some of you don't know her at all. but those of us in this part of the room have had the privilege of watching one of the finest surgical minds in the country develop over the last 15 years, and I want her family to know exactly who they have in this room tonight. Silence. The kind that fills a room like water. She spoke for maybe 90 seconds. She named my publications, the program I'd built, the surgical techniques I'd helped refine, the residents I'd trained. She said, and I will remember this until I die. Ellie didn't become this in spite of her upbringing. She became it because she decided, at 17 years old, that she would not let anyone else define the edges of her life. Then Dr. Vasquez Kim started clapping. Then all 14 of them. And then, because a room takes its emotional cues from the most confident people in it, everyone else joined in. I looked across the room at my father. He was standing next to my uncle, a glass of wine in his hand, and he was not clapping. He was just still, completely still. Like the sound had turned off around him. His expression wasn't embarrassed, exactly. It was something more complicated than that. Something that looked, more than anything, like a man realizing he'd been reading a map upside down for 30 years. My mother was crying. Not gently. The way she cries at everything, which has always embarrassed my father and always made me love her. But really crying, in the way you cry when something you've been holding privately for a very long time finally has a name. Kevin came across the room and hugged me hard enough that I felt it in my ribs. I'm so proud of you, he said into my shoulder. I've always been so proud of you. I held on. The rest of the evening moved the way good evenings move, full and a little blurry and punctuated by moments you know you'll remember. I danced with Blythe. I had a long conversation with Dr. Nkemdram about a grant we'd both been thinking about applying for. I ate my dinner and it was good. My father found me around 9 o'clock. The reception was still going. People were on the dance floor. The vineyard was dark outside the windows but strung with small lights that made everything amber. He came up next to me where I was standing near the bar. Not quite beside me, slightly at an angle. The way he always approached difficult things, sideways rather than head-on. He didn't say anything for a moment. Just stood there, looking out at the room. Then he said, I didn't know about the research papers. I looked at him. He was still looking out at the room. Your mother had an article saved on her computer. She showed me once. He stopped. I didn't look at it long enough. I waited. That woman tonight, he said. Dr. Shu, she said. He paused again. He was not a man who talked around feelings easily. Every sentence was clearly an effort. She said you trained surgeons. I have a few residents I mentor. Yes. There are surgeons who learned from you. Yes. He was quiet. His jaw moved slightly like he was chewing on something that wouldn't break down. I didn't understand what you were doing, he said finally. I thought I was being practical. I thought I was protecting you from. He made a gesture with his free hand that I think was meant to encompass disappointment, failure, the long fall off the high ledge. I didn't understand what you were doing. I had been waiting for this conversation in some form for 15 years, and now that it was happening, I found that I didn't have a prepared speech. I wasn't angry. I wasn't relieved, exactly. I was just present in it. Standing next to my father in the amber light of my brother's wedding reception, both of us looking out at the people dancing. No, I said. He made a sound that might have been the beginning of something else. An apology, a fuller explanation. But it didn't fully form. He was Gene from Millbrook, Ohio. He was 67 years old and had spent most of his emotional life indoors. This was already more than I'd expected. And then, quietly, he said, I'm proud of you, Ellie. 3 words. 1 syllable each, almost, except my name. I had been waiting for those words for such a long time that when they came, I almost didn't recognize them. I just stood there, and my eyes got hot, and I looked at my hands and I breathed. Thank you, I said. It wasn't a perfect moment. It wasn't a movie moment, with swelling strings and the perfect lighting. He didn't suddenly transform into someone who understood my life, or could talk about surgical technique over dinner. He was still my father, which means he was still partial and complicated and shaped by everything that had shaped him. But it was real, and real, I've learned, is so much better than perfect. I drove back to Chicago on Sunday afternoon. Late spring Ohio was all green and gray, those heavy clouds that can't decide whether to rain. I had a podcast on, but I wasn't listening to it. I was thinking about something Dr. Hashu had said. Not in her speech, but afterward, when we'd stepped outside for a few minutes of quiet. Do you know what I remember about you from that first rotation, she'd asked. I shook my head. I remember that you never asked for permission, she said. Other students, they'd come in hoping no one would notice if they made a mistake. You came in hoping someone would let you do more. That's rare. That's the thing you can't teach. I didn't know what to do with that, so I just thanked her and went back inside. But driving home on Sunday, I kept coming back to it. I had spent a lot of years, measuring myself against my father's silence, wondering if what I'd built was real, if the one person who should have been proudest had said so little about it. I don't think I ever let it stop me. But I think it bent me a little. In some places I'm still finding. And somewhere on I-70 heading west, in the middle lane, with the clouds finally deciding to rain, I thought, I'm going to stop waiting for the ledger to balance. Not because the conversation at the wedding had fixed everything. It hadn't. And nothing was going to retroactively make all those Thanksgiving dinners not happen. But because I had 200 years of my own life left to live, and I was going to need both hands free. My father had said he was proud of me. That was enough. Not because it was everything, but because it was something, and something real is more than some people ever get. I turned the radio on, found a station playing something old and warm and slightly corny, the kind of song my mother would have hummed along to in the kitchen on Saturday mornings when I was small, and I drove.